Vitus asked me to start off, and I want to thank you all again once for joining this session with us, just like Mohammed, Mr. Sultan spoke. And this is about data rights and stakeholder mapping for West Africa. I led the research for this particular study, and they've introduced my colleagues, Leonard, who is also a Nigerian here with me, Innocence, a cybersecurity expert in Togo. She's presently dialing in, joining us from Togo, and our good friend, the moderator, is Emmanuel Vitus, joining us from, I think, Togo of France. You know, so I'll just take it up from here, and I hope the interpreter is following me now, because I want to start my presentation, and I'll start with sharing my slides. Thank you all. Okay, thank you all. And this is my first slide. This is a virtual presentation and discussion of the draft reports on data rights in West Africa. We mapped policy processes and data rights stakeholder in West Africa. And I have to bring this up clear right now, because for those of you who know me in real life, I'm a fast talker. Talk very, very fast, but I've been advised to talk slowly so that the interpreter who is translating from English to French will be able to follow me. So I apologize, and I pray you all indulge me. So thank you very much. I go to the next slide. So this report, just like Mohammed and Emmanuel said, was commissioned by OSIWA. In having our inception meeting with OSIWA, we identified the two main themes that would come under the scope of the report. And this report, just like we said, is about mapping stakeholders. Mapping stakeholders and policy processes in West Africa. West Africa comprises of about 16 countries. So the first main theme under the scope of work will be, who are these data rights stakeholders in West Africa? And the second theme identified under the scope of work will be, what is the data rights policy making process in West Africa, and if it involves any form of stakeholder mechanism. I go to the next slide. Now, in identifying this scope of work, we looked at secondary research objectives. Three of them, we came up with three of them. The first one was to provide an insight and critical analysis on potential pathways to support the involvement of citizens in the design, regulation, and application of technology and data rights policy making. That's the first element in the secondary research objective. The second element was to map data rights stakeholders in West Africa. And as in my subsequent slides, you would see that we categorized these stakeholders as civil society, private sector, research institutes, advocates, public agencies, and obviously policy processes across West Africa. And the last link of our secondary research objective was to identify emerging tech policy issues that have some impact from a social, economic, or political perspective in West Africa. I go to the next slide. Now, the methodology employed for this research was based on one text research, where we had to look for materials in the public domain or in open source that had to do with stakeholders in data rights in West Africa. And the second methodology employed for this study was utilized a structured questionnaire where we sent out questions to the public, soliciting for them to identify their interest in data rights. This form was made in English and French and was out we shared it online across the various social media for at least 6 weeks. Then preliminary matters. I go to the next slide from there. I want to make clear here, because I have some of my colleagues joining in who are lawyers, and they kind of like wanted to know if this is some sort of legal seminar or something along those lines. I want to make it clear that this is not a legal report. It's just a report or tech policy report that looks at these data rights issues from a public policy perspective. Despite the fact that I have a background in law, and Leonard also has a background in law, and we took a multidisciplinary approach in producing the report, because we have two other members of the research team as non-lawyers. Thank you. I go to the next slide. Now the question then becomes, what are data rights? And because this is not a legal report, where it's flexible in how we interpret data rights and data. Our interpretation feels based on Western's concept of privacy as control over information, and also includes the right of a person to make decisions regarding how data relating to him will be used. Now, it includes, now this data for the purpose of this research includes personal and non-personal data. And lawyers here would agree with me, lawyers who work in data protection or data rights would agree with me that for information to be personal, it must have certain elements. Now, for the purpose of this study, we kind of like came to the conclusion that if these requirements for information to be personal data and not kind of absent, then that implies that the information is non-personal. And for this reason, we included both personal and non-personal data as within the scope of this research. And for the purpose of our interpretation, it also includes the right to use this data in a manner that respects fundamental human rights. And lastly, it must enable the exercise of data subject rights. I go to the next slide. Now, what then are data policies? Now, I read from the slide. These are government's declarations, legal instruments that have the force of law and creates enforceable obligations in respect to data rights in West Africa. For example, a typical example would be the ECOWAS Data Protection Act of 2010, which is at the regional level. Then we also looked at statutes, various data protection or statutes that touch on data rights in multiple West African countries. And based on their importance, the research focused on data protection legislation. We kind of came to the conclusion in our research work that on the basis of subject matter, we should look at data policies that prescribe the manner in which an individual or an organization may use personal data. And that is what we know as data protection legislation. Then because of it's the second, in terms of subject matter, the second theme we touched on, we looked at was data policies that have to do with the registration of, or rather the registration of personal data in a government identity database. We felt this was very important because of its social benefits. For instance, I understand in Senegal, we have the database where telecommunications users are required to register their personal data. And it is important because if you do not register your data in such database, you're unable to use telecommunication services. So we decided to focus on those types of data policies on the basis of that subject matter. Thank you. I go to the next slide. Now, why data rights? And I think the interest for data rights is primarily technologies have evolved so fast that they now have the capability to take and process this information, while at the same time this creates risk for the data subjects. A typical example of this would be online behavioral advertising. Everybody here, everybody that has logged in to this webinar uses the internet. We are all familiar with how cookies track us and information they gather, which they can sell to third parties, or they can use it to provide some sort of services to us. This is a data risk. And we also have facial recognition technologies, which is being talked about in different countries, and how the states or government authorities use it to conduct surveillance activities for the citizens. Then we have predictive marketing marketing, whereby technologies use big data to be able to predict and profile you and predict some sort of what you could do or what they think you can do. And this also creates some data risks. For example, you could discriminate, you could discriminate output for the data subjects. And these all result in data harms. So that was the primary motivation for focusing on data rights. And just to make this clear, the report is in draft, and at some point during this webinar, Emmanuel is going to share the link where we can access it and look at it. And if there is need to also make feedback outside of this webinar, it's very much welcome. So I'm just trying to give a high-level summary of what we did in our reports. I go to the next slide. Now, we talked about data rights. We also, the focus of this research was to look at how data right policies are made in West Africa. So data right policies are generally made in West Africa from lawmaking, where the parliament or the national legislature make laws that touch data rights, or administrative rulemaking, where public authorities, by powers given to them by law, establishing them, are able to make, for instance, rules, regulations, guidelines, and subsidiary legislations. In that respect, we have case laws, which are decisions by courts that have an impact on how data policies will be implemented and enforced. And we in our reports, we looked at, we talked extensively of how these data policies are made and whether it
Chooks, sorry to interrupt you, but I think your voice is echoing, so it's difficult to hear you. If you can speak maybe a bit louder, I think it can help the audience.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Thank you, Emmanuel. Is this good enough?
Yes, now we can hear you.
I'm sorry about that. Okay, in West Africa, we looked at the lawmaking process and whether it involves any form of stakeholder engagement, because that was the primary assignment given to us by OSIWA. And we looked at community laws, for example, the ECOWAS Data Protection Act of 2010. Now, this community law commenced with an advisory opinion by the ECOWAS Parliament that recommended for the adoption of this community legislation. Then thereafter, the next stage, the memorandum of the meeting of ECOWAS Telecoms and ICT ministers also recommended the adoption of the ECOWAS Data Protection Act, which went the next stage for this was the ECOWAS Council of Ministers adopts this recommendation and forwards it to the ECOWAS authority of the ECOWAS heads of state, whereby from there they approved this recommendation and the ECOWAS Data Protection Act came into force. I go to the next slide. I'm sorry, can anybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Chooks. Chooks, we can hear you, but now we can't hear you anymore.
Can you hear me now?
It's clear. Yeah, we can hear you.
I think my computer froze, or I'm trying to move my slide to the next. Let me share again. I'm having technical challenges. I apologize. I don't know what this is. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm back online now. I apologize for that. It was a technical challenge I had. I think I fixed it. So I go to the next slide now. Now, the stakeholder engagement process for ECOWAS policy making involves, there are two mechanisms by which the stakeholders can be involved in ECOWAS policy making. The first one would be the Forum of Association recognized by ECOWAS. This is an organization established by the ECOWAS Council of Ministers in 1996 and has a membership that spans civil societies and NGOs across the region. Officially, FAIR is authorized is to provide a forum. It's to provide a forum for where NGOs and civil society can make collective recommendations on prospective actions of ECOWAS institution and submit to the Council for consideration. Our DEX research indicates that the last activity for this body occurred in 2008, where it held a meeting in Cotonou, Benin Republic. I go to the next slide. There's also a second mechanism where stakeholders can be involved in ECOWAS policy making. The second one would be through the West African Civil Society Forum, which is WACSOF. Now, WACSOF was created by ECOWAS as the umbrella organization of CSOs from ECOWAS member states. It is a channel through which civil society contributes to every aspect of policymaking by ECOWAS institutions. And most times, this organization is invited by ECOWAS to make contributions on ECOWAS policymaking. And I just need to make clear that in terms of stakeholder mechanism at the ECOWAS level, it specifically relates to only civil society or non-governmental organizations. There is no mention that individuals like you and I, the citizens, can actually take part in the stakeholder engagement forum processes. But that is not to say that we can take part. Obviously, that would be through one of these, either the FAIR or the West African Civil Society Forum. I just wanted to make that clear. I go next to the next slide. Then lawmaking, which is also a way in which data policies are created in West Africa, would also happen at the national level of individual member states of ECOWAS. Now, we looked at it from an Anglophone perspective and a Francophone perspective. From an Anglophone perspective, it normally commences with the first reading. Then it goes to the next stage, which is the second reading. Then it is at this stage that the stakeholder engagement can happen. And it normally happens either through public hearing, where the committee that is looking at considering the bill could invite stakeholders to the public, make an invitation to the public to have them come and make their contribution in respect of that bill. It could also be that an invitation is extended to select stakeholders to come and make contribution, or you and I, as sophisticated citizens, are aware that a bill is presently considered by the Parliament, would make our own individual contribution in respect of that bill. Then it goes on to the third reading, where the bill is read by a certain percentage of the National Assembly and sent off to the President for his accent. For his signature. I go to the next slide. From a Francophone perspective, the lawmaking commences at the preliminary stage, where this legislative proposal is prepared for submission and may involve some review by the Council of Ministers or a review by the Office of the President. Then the next stage would be the pre-committee stage, where the Council of States would review the bill, especially if it is a private member bill. Then the next stage from there would be an examination of the bill in the committee. It is at this stage that the stakeholder engagement will occur, where the committee invites members of the public to make contributions in respect of the bill. Then after that stage, it goes to the next stage at the other chamber. Yeah. Sorry, Emmanuel, did you say something?
Oui, bonjour.
Okay, I go on, I continue. So it goes, if it's in Parliament that consists of two chambers, for instance, a bicameral legislature like we have in Nigeria, it goes to the other. Well, this is Francophone. Some Francophone countries have bicameral legislature. It goes to that chamber where the same process starts all over. Then once it is passed by both chambers, and obviously harmonized, if there are differences between what each chamber has done with respect of that data policy or data policy that touches on data rights, then it goes to the president and the president signs his signature. That's the lawmaking, typical lawmaking process in Anglophone West Africa and Anglophone and Francophone West Africa. I go to the next stage, the next slide, sorry. Then we said lawmaking is just one aspect in which data policies are made in West Africa. The next one we touched in our report was administrative rulemaking, where public authorities by law are able to make rules and regulations that could touch data rights. And the process for this normally commences. It's basically some similarity across West African countries. The process normally starts where the authority notifies the public of its intention to issue a new rule and request for comments. For example, this happens in Nigeria, where some public authorities send out notifies the public that they intend to propose new regulations. Then this notification is accompanied by a copy of the proposed rule. Then stakeholders are from there requested to make their contributions. Then the next stage, agency, the public authority receives the comments, considers it, and may decide to amend the proposed rule in line with what stakeholders feedback. And the last stage would be the agency issues a final version of the proposed rule, after which it comes into force. I go to the next slide. Then there is a slight variation in some West African countries. For instance, in Ghana and Gambia, the proposed rule is presented to the relevant committee of the National Legislature for review of the Constitution. No stakeholder. There's also no stakeholder engagement in Ghana. Then in Francophone West Africa, we understand that there is no notification of the proposed rule to the public, and then thus there is no stakeholder engagement. What happens is that the agency, the public authority, just decide to make a regulation and then publish it at the next day and it comes into force. Now we've looked at how stakeholders are involved in data quality at the ECOWAS level and also at the national level in the various countries. Now we conducted an assessment of these stakeholder engagement mechanisms and to see how effective they were. And this is all listed out in our report, much more extensive than what you see on the slides. Now, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is the OEC, recommends that for public engagement or consultation to be effective, it must comprise of public information. Now, we found this to be deficient in several countries of West Africa in terms of how stakeholders may engage with data rights, except for a few countries like Ghana and Gambia, where policymaking or proposed legislation are accompanied by explanatory notes. These explanatory notes explain the purpose of the proposed bill and gives an insight into what it seeks to achieve. Then the next element recommended by the OCD is public consultation. Now, example of a deficiency, we determined it to be stakeholder consultation to be deficient because it was inconsistent with the Gunning principle. The Gunning principle is based on a case in the United Kingdom. And according to that case, for consultation to be effective, it must be done. First element to be satisfied is that it must be done. The consultation must be done when the proposal are at a formative stage. The second element is that it must provide an adequate information to stakeholders to enable them make informed decision. The third element is that stakeholders must be given adequate time to respond. And lastly, the decision maker must be able to show that they considered all the responses from the stakeholders. That is the second element recommended by OECD. And the last element, which is public participation, and it also flows from the second element, is that we found this to be deficient in several respects in multiple West African countries because there was no evidence that comments received are actually considered by policymakers except in a few cases. This is all detailed in our report, which runs for about 80 pages. I go to the next slide. Now, just like we assessed the stakeholders and how they interact with data rights policy making in West Africa, we also identify who these stakeholders are in West Africa. And the methodology we applied for this, just like we explained in previous slides, was based on research, research and the use of a structured questionnaire. In identifying these stakeholders, we categorize them as follows. I'm on the next slide. Regional and national legislatures, ministries, departments, agencies, and data protection authorities, law enforcement agencies, tech companies, research institutes and think tank, international donor and development organizations, regional ECOWAS, intergovernmental organizations, non-regional intergovernmental organizations, and civil society, NGOs, and the human rights organizations. So these are the broad categories of stakeholders we formulated for this study. I go to the next slide. Then we created a stakeholder table or matrix where we represented the identified stakeholders in their category in a stakeholder analysis matrix. Information in this matrix is arranged vertically for each of the identified stakeholders based on a set of predefined stakeholder characteristics. This matrix is a modified version of the stakeholder analysis matrix developed in Brickendorf and Crosby 2002. I go to the next slide. Now, this is what the template we used for the stakeholder analysis looks like. So we start up first with the name of the stakeholder, the reach of the stakeholder in terms of whether the reach is not regional or within a specific country, the nature of the stakeholder's interest, the power or influence of the stakeholder, the level of knowledge of that stakeholder, and the resources available to that stakeholder, and the ability of the stakeholder to mobilize resources. I go to the next slide. Now, this is just statistics, which is much more detailed in our report. I just want to give you just the highlights of some of the observations and what the statistics shows. In our stakeholder mapping exercise, we identified 682 stakeholders of data rights across West Africa, and this is what the statistics shows. Now, 17% of those stakeholders are in Côte d'Ivoire. Guinea-Bissau has 2%, Nigeria has 7%, Senegal has 5%, Togo has 4%. So you can see this is just the elements of the statistics, and this is what it points to. I go to the next slide. Now, in terms of percentage categories of stakeholders in West Africa, we find that 38% of these stakeholders are tech companies. Civil society is 14%. Non-governmental organizations, non-regional intergovernmental organizations who are non-record identified, and research institute and think tank, 5%. It's important for me to say at this point that we used an Excel spreadsheet, for each particular country, for each categorization of stakeholder to represent this information. And this is also detailed in the report, where from the report you can access a link to the Excel spreadsheet and see the information we were able to generate, which is much more extensive than what I have on the slide here. I go to the next slide. Then for Côte d'Ivoire, we have, this is what the statistics shows. We have tech companies at 61%. We have ministries, the public authorities, public agencies as 21%, and the law enforcement agencies as 2%. I go to the next slide. Then some of these stakeholders identified, especially in the civil society categories in Côte d'Ivoire. For instance, we identified in Côte d'Ivoire the Action for the Protection of Human Rights, which we categorized as a civil society. We also identified in the civil society category the Côte d'Ivoire Bar Association, and also the Movement for Health Education and Development, MERSAD. I go to the next slide. Then for Nigeria, this is what the statistics shows. We identified 49 stakeholders. 29 of these stakeholders, 29% of the stakeholders are in the civil society categories, while the tech companies represent 24%, and the research institute and think tank represents 4%. I go to the next slide. Now, some of these civil society stakeholders in Nigeria we identified are the Paradigm Initiative, the Digital Rights Lawyers Initiative, the Nigerian Bar Association, and the Media Rights Agenda. I go to the next slide. And for Senegal, we identified 34 stakeholders of data rights. 32% of them are in the ministries, departments, agencies categories. The civil society represents 21%. Law enforcement agencies represents 9%, and the international donor and development organizations represent 6%. I go to the next slide. Then, for instance, some of these civil society stakeholders in Senegal are Article 19, Junction Senegal, Amnesty International, and the Open Society Initiative for West Africa. I go to the next slide. Then our observations from the stakeholder mapping exercise, because we set out some stakeholder characteristics and we made some conclusions at the end of our reports. Now, we found the most powerful stakeholders from our mapping exercise are to be in 4 different groups. The first group are the national legislature, the ministries, department, agencies, data protection authorities, and the law enforcement agencies, whose source of power derives from the provision of law. And in the second group are the tech companies who are able to organize themselves into a lobbying coalition to influence data rights policies. Then the third groups are the civil society, especially those that litigate data rights claims. And the last, 4th group are international donor and development agencies, who through their finance grants are capable to influence data rights policies. A typical example of this would be in Nigeria, where the World Bank is funding the Identity Project, and it requested that for the Nigerian government to be able to access this sum of money, they should enact a data protection legislation that would provide safeguard when the digital identity database goes live. I go to the next slide. Now, in terms of stakeholders' level of knowledge, this ranges from medium to high. The medium for the national legislature and high, very high for civil society. Then in terms of the ability of the stakeholders to mobilize resources, it is very high for the stakeholders, since they are all entities rather than individuals and can make decisions regarding the use of these resources. I go to the next slide. Now, what are the recommendations on how stakeholders may interact and be engaged in data rights policy making in West Africa? We've analyzed what the data rights policy looks like in West Africa. We've analyzed, assessed how stakeholders can engage in this policy making. We've also been able to look at how this data rights policy is efficient. We now make recommendations on how to improve stakeholder engagement. And the first one would be to conduct regulatory impact assessment for data policies. Basically, it's to look at to conduct an impact assessment on how these data policies would impact certain aspects of the economy, could even be from a human rights perspective, things along that nature. And it is forward-looking in the sense that it happens prior to the data policy having the force of law. The next recommendation we made was to establish processes involving stakeholders for monitoring and evaluating data rights policies. We felt this was unlike regulatory impact assessment. This is backward looking, and we felt that it's important for the citizens and stakeholders to be part of this monitoring and evaluation, since obviously they are subject to these data policies. Then we also recommended that policy making should be accompanied, in all instances, should be accompanied by explanatory notes. In previous slides, we talked about what the explanatory notes does And we found that to only happen in 2 countries from our research, Ghana and Gambia. And this is unlike other countries where explanatory notes usually accompany policies and possible policies. I go to the next slide. Then we also recommended that stakeholders should be involved in all stages of the policy making. What we observed in our research is that stakeholders are usually called in probably at the point in time when the policy is being drafted or it's being developed. We want stakeholders to be involved from beginning stage, from the get-go when the policy is still being at its concept level. Then we also recommended that enact legislation that mandates public consultation in all policy making. This is self-explanatory. Then we recommended as well that public consultation must be in accordance with the governing principles. I've explained in previous slides what the governing principle looks like and how it originated from the case in the United Kingdom. And it's acceptable as a standard for an effective public consultation. So we made recommendations in that regard. I go to the next slide. And we also recommended that the use of the internet and social media by policymakers as a channel for stakeholder consultation. And lastly, we recommended that ECOWAS policymaking should provide some sort of process whereby citizens from individual member states become aware and are able to participate in ECOWAS policymaking. I go to the next slide. Wow, thank you for listening to me, and thank you for your patience to stick with me. Thank you. So Emmanuel, this is over to you now. I'm about to stop sharing my slide. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chooks. I think that was very brilliant and very, very, how do you call it, insightful report. I can see Nina putting a very good comment out there. So I think we'll now quickly open the question and answer session so that everyone can actually contribute to this report. The link was shared in the chat during the presentation, and I think I took a good summary of what is actually the conclusion of what we actually did in those countries across the region. So I will take first questions, but let me tell you that you can post your comment either in the question and answer session or put it directly in the chat. You can also raise your hand so that the technical support give you the opportunity to bring your comment to this report. And also, I will now open the floor for the first question. I can see it from the question and answer session, and I think Chooks and the other researchers will be right there to provide answers to your questions. So the first question is from sorry if I pronounce the name very wrong. The name is Iyani Nwanko, and the question is, why is the court not identified as a stakeholder? Does it not make policy through its interpretation of the law and dispute resolution? So I think the question is to the lead researcher, Chooks. You can open your mic and provide your answer to it. I know Leonard is on the call, Innocent is on the call. If any of you want to also respond to the call, you can still open your mic to provide your contribution to the question of our audience. So Chooks, over to you.
Thank you. Excellent question. Yes, to a certain extent, and I stand to be corrected, and that is the whole purpose of this conversation we're having for feedback from stakeholders like you as well. What we did was we looked at stakeholders actively involved in data rights. You know, from my opinion, and I'm not sure if every other person would agree with me, in as much as we saw the judiciary as stakeholders, but they were to a certain extent remotely involved. The only time their interest in data rights could be triggered is when cases come before them. You know, but these stakeholders we identified were those that were specifically involved in data rights policies. Then you also notice that I made mention in my earlier slides that case laws are actually a form in which data rights are made. I listed 3. One of them was lawmaking, the other one was administrative rulemaking, then the last one was through case laws by the courts. But we did not want to focus on that for the same reasons I've given earlier. And especially sometimes in terms of stakeholder participation, it may be a bit difficult for citizens, not in all cases. I know in America, for instance, anybody can just go to the court, even if you're not a party, and say, I have an interest and I want to make some submissions. But in Nigeria, that process exists, but then it has to be subject to what the court says. So we felt that was a bit of a high standard to meet for individuals to be involved, or rather for stakeholders to be associated with judicial decision making as a form of data rights policy making. Thank you. I hope that answers your question adequately. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chooks. I think Leonard is on the call, and if anyone also wants to intervene to this particular question, you can still come in. And I think from our conversations, during this work, we came to the conclusion that, for example, every organization that works on litigation, is considered as a stakeholder. And if you can see, majority of the countries, we put the bar associations, for example, the lawyers who actually litigate data rights issues, we put them as a stakeholder group. And I think Chooks just provide a very extensive answer regarding the courts not being identified as a stakeholder group. And I can see that it continues by saying that the concept of data right is unique, and the content appear to mean data privacy and data protection. Reconsideration of that term. Chooks, what's your take of that?
Sorry, can you tell the name of the person who asked that question? And if he's the person I think is out, it would be a good forum to have that conversation. Please tell me who asked the question.
The name is actually very difficult to pronounce. Again, it's called Iyanu.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. I was expecting that because thank you, Fine, for asking that question. I was expecting that. Yes, I totally agree with you to a certain extent because data rights from our dictionary from data privacy practitioners and data protection practitioners are not so much conversant with that. But we had a meeting with OSIWA, and then from the nature of the solicitation that came in requesting for researchers to engage in this research work, I think the term used was data rights. We had several meetings with them, and we understood that in as much as they used data rights, which is not so familiar with data privacy practitioners, the whole idea, the subject matter was data privacy, but this is still, like I said, the report is still in draft, and if it would lead to some sort of confusion, especially for data privacy practitioners, then I think there's a possibility we can go back and rephrase to actually make it data privacy rights rather than data rights. Thank you, Fine, for that question. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this response. I think the floor is still open. You can put your, how do you call it, question in the chat or question and answer button. Just click on it and put your question there or contribution, because the objective is to take contribution in as much as possible to make this report more inclusive and also more extensive. So you can also raise your hand if you want to ask the question directly, to the speakers. And I think at the end, we'll also provide an email for those who want to take time to read the report and provide their comment to it. I think we'll post the emails in the chat so that you can actually reach out directly to bring your contribution, to this report before we finalize it. So the floor is still open. I can see a lot of people in the room. Feel free to ask your question. Feel free to look at the stakeholders in your country, because we identify all the 15 countries within the West African region. You can see it in the Excel sheet. The link is posted in the chat. So you can ask questions, about your country, about the stakeholders in your country, why some are involved, why some are not involved. You can still send emails, you can still reach out so that we actually provide an answer to that or include whatever we will miss, in those particular countries. So I can see that there's no question, meaning that everything was very, very, very clear, very insightful to every one of you. I can see Nina put a question there. The question is that, what role are think tanks and academia playing? Did you group them under civil society? Chooks, over to you.
Thank you, Nina. Excellent question. Okay, short answer to your question. No, we did not group them as civil society. As a matter of fact, I also belong to a research institute, the African Academic Network on Internet Policy, which was also listed as a stakeholders. So what these type of stakeholders do is they conduct researches, and through their researches, academic researches, they're able to shape public policy through debate, informing debates about different aspects of data rights. And we have quite a lot of them in Nigeria. And to a certain extent, if you look at the slides, you'll see some tertiary institutions, some universities were actually listed as research institutes within that stakeholder categorization. Thank you, Nina.
Thank you very much, Chooks, for your response. I can maybe go to the francophones. Donc, chers amis, comme on le disait tout à l'heure, nous pourrons poser des questions. Poser des questions pour que, voilà, on puisse quand même apporter des réponses. Identifier vos différents pays, parce que le rapport a été élaboré dans 15 pays, donc tous les pays de la CEDEAO. Donc, vous pouvez aussi jeter un coup d'œil sur les liens qui ont été partagés pour voir les acteurs qui ont été identifiés dans vos différents pays et puis poser des questions sur la cartographie qui a été faite. S'il y a des acteurs qui manquent et que vous croyez que voilà, sont des acteurs vraiment influents sur les questions de droit des données, vous pouvez aussi nous envoyer un email ou bien poser la question directement ici ou bien apporter votre contribution directement ici pour que voilà, on puisse apporter des réponses appropriées à vos questions. So I think no questions, and I think maybe no questions means that a majority of them got it. I can see another question from Nina again. He said, I've also not read the full report, but did we group clearly define what come under personal data, identity, health, online consumption, search history? I did not see that in the presentation. So, Chooks, Nina, I want to know if we actually group them clearly or define them, in the reports.
Thank you, Nina. Thank you. What we did in the report was that you have to understand that the focus of this research was to identify the data rights stakeholders. The primary focus was to identify the data rights stakeholders and to conduct an assessment of how stakeholders interact in data rights policy making in West Africa. That was the primary focus. We also decided to touch on data, how data is interpreted, just to give readers and audience just sort of like a preliminary on sort of like a background into what real main thrust of this study is. So to a certain extent, yes, we had our own concept of what constitutes personal and non-personal data as well. Then we'd also, not beyond that, extensively talked about data harms, which wasn't part of this presentation. Now, these are the risks that could arise from how technologies exploit these data that could cause some harms to the data subjects. And we extensively talked about this and the various several types of harm and how they relate to different types of personal data. So to that extent, that is what we did in MENA. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much, Chooks. I think we don't have questions and answers. I can see a question from Malik. And the question from Malik is to actually to know whether the big tech, the Meta, Google, Microsoft, etc., local stakeholders, you want to know if we group them and as a local stakeholder, did you have any information in their intervention within the region? So I think Chooks is over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Malik, for that question. Yes, we identified big tech as stakeholders, but in some parts we identified them as national stakeholders, but in most parts we identified them as international stakeholders, though not based in West Africa. That's due to the nature of their influence and activities in West Africa. We created a separate Excel spreadsheet where we listed those stakeholders not ordinarily present in West Africa, but also having an interest in data right policies in West Africa. And that includes big tech like Facebook, all of those companies. So it was all part of the stakeholder mapping exercise we conducted. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chooks. I think we can now post the questions or post the emails. So Chooks, maybe you can start posting the emails to the audience so that they can send their contribution. I think Nina who want to read the report throughout the weekend, and I know others will do same so that they can produce their, comments and suggestions so that we actually include them in this report. So thank you everyone for participating, in this webinar. We'll take the final word from OSIWA and the lead researcher, then we can call this a day. So over to you, Mohammed. Is Mohammed in the room? No, I can't see him in the room. So Chooks, maybe you would like to speak on behalf of the research team, while maybe Malik can speak on behalf of OSIWA to come to the conclusion of this webinar.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Thank you. I just want to thank everybody who could make out the time to have this conversation with us. I would also kindly request that you take your time. I've posted my email address in this chat box, and I want anybody who wants to reach out to me in respect of this study to available to take feedback. The report is still in draft. The final copy has not been made, and after we'll collect the feedbacks from this webinar and see how we can improve on our work, and then we'll finally give out a copy. And just so you know, we may have to send, when the report is finally out, we may have to look through your email address, if you don't mind, the email address you use for registering on this webinar, and then send you a copy when it's published, eventually published. And I want to thank you on behalf of my research team. I have a wonderful, excellent people I worked with this on this research, and then we will span for a period of 3-4 months. And then I also want to use the opportunity to thank each one of them. Leonard, I thank you very much for being available to work with me on this, and thank you very much. I express my gratitude. And Innocent, I thank you so much. It was a wonderful experience having you with us. You brought a new insights to this work, and I thank you very much. I never met you in person. We all spoke on phone, and it's wonderful. I really want to thank you. And Emmanuel, you've been a very, very wonderful, great person, a person I could always call to reach out in respect of what's happening in Francophone. And I'm very grateful. And this is an opportunity, for us to continue the conversation in respect of data rights and within West Africa. And thank you all for everybody being here. And this is over to you, Malik. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Chucks. Thank you to everyone for attending this webinar, the presentation of this report. For OSIWA, this is just the beginning. We are entering this field, and it was important for us to do it evidence-based, to start with the report, map the partners, the issues, because we know that data privacy, data rights, digital rights have a huge impact on our work, our thematics of work, whether it is on education, on health, on public liberties, and so on. That's why we want to have this report. This is work in progress. We are going to integrate all the comments, recommendations in the report, have a very thorough and interesting report, which is going to be shared after to the general public, and we'll take it from there. This issue is very important for us at OSIWA and globally at OSF, and I'm sure we'll reach out to you for the next stage of this work. Thank you very much. Thank you to you all. Thank you to the to our researcher, the team, Chooks, and your team. Yeah, thank you for the wonderful work. Bye. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Malik. Thank you everyone for participating, and we hope to receive your comments. I think the email was shared. The link of the report was shared as well, so that we'll actually also send you the presentation to your email you use for registration. I can see people asking if they can have access to the recording. I think I will let Chooks respond to that, but the presentation, I think will be shared to all of you with your email that you use for registration. So to Chooks, I will let you conclude on this, whether we share the recording or not, and also conclude on this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you. Just to say this, I'm a bit concerned that data privacy rights in West Africa may not allow us to share this webinar except with the consent of people whose personal data are actually obvious from the webinar. So if I can get the consent of the panelists and the individuals who spoke during this webinar, that it can be shared with third parties, then yes, I can. But outside of that, I have no problem. But it's not left for only me to decide. I still have to speak with other panelists and other speakers during this webinar to get their consent. And if that happens, definitely I'll be sharing it with third parties. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chooks. This brings us to an end of this meeting. Thank you everyone for participating. Have a very wonderful weekend, and we'll keep in touch. Bye.